All right, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Alabama Education Fund Forum. We do educational forums on a lot of different topics, and tonight we're focused on civic education. And tonight we've got a panel of experts that are going to help all of us get ready for the upcoming legislative session and preparing for a really dynamic and intensive season of advocacy with the Alabama legislators in Montgomery. And so tonight's forum is going to give basic skills that we all need to understand about, for example, how a bill becomes a law and the legislative process and how to monitor the legislature. Lots of different conversations tonight that are all going to come together to make us all better and able to advocate for our needs. And so I'm going to hand this off to Kim Bailey, who is our moderator tonight. And she will introduce the panelists and we'll get started. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Let's just do a little housekeeping before we get started. I know you're all going to have questions, so any questions should be submitted using the Q&A button instead of the chat button. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a button it's new for this webinar instead of a regular Zoom session, that's Q&A. So if you use that, it's easier for everybody to keep track of those questions. Also, when the link to the video is emailed to you, any links that are put in the chat will be included in that email. So you have access to all that information. Okay, so we have a full agenda, so we're going to jump right in. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and let's start with Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to join you tonight. My name is Katie Glenn. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a senior policy associate with the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery.
Okay, Patricia.
I am Patricia Todd. I'm the Southern Policy Manager for Jobs to Move America and served 12 years in the legislature.
No badge of honor for that. Tara?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tara Bailey. I live here in Madison, Alabama, and I am the director of the Alabama Channel. It's a project of the League of Women Voters of Alabama Education Fund. I'm happy to be here with you all tonight.
All right, and last but not least, Roger.
Yes, good evening. My name is Roger Ellis. I'm chairman of Voter Services with the League of Women Voters Tennessee Valley and also the state level League of Women Voters.
Great. All right, thanks to all of you for giving your time this evening to discuss these very important topics. So, Katie, will you get us started with information on how a bill becomes a law in Alabama?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you to the League of Women Voters for holding this forum tonight. I always tell folks when I talk about the legislature that the legislature, the legislative session, coming to Montgomery is all in a really opaque and sometimes difficult process to navigate. And that, in my opinion, is on purpose, right? There's a reason that certain powers might prefer it, that we were less engaged, that we were less likely to show up in town. So it's important that we share this information, that we share it with each other, and that we are prepared in advance of the legislative session starting this year. So again, I would encourage folks to drop questions in the chat because we'll get to those at the end. But I'm going to do my best to cover in just a few minutes sort of legislative session 101. So the most important thing to know off the top is, when is the legislative session? This is a February year. So our legislative session start and end date are constitutionally appointed dates. They run in a 4-year cycle called the quadrennium, which aligns with the 4-year term of a legislator. In the first year of the quadrennium, the legislature starts in early March. In the second and third year of the quadrennium, the legislature starts the first Tuesday in February. And in the fourth and final year, the legislature starts the second Tuesday in January. That is because that's the year that they'll all be out running for re-election, and they are not allowed to campaign while they're in session. So they want to get started early so they can be done early. So we will start that first Tuesday in February, and the longest that the legislative session can go is 30 legislative days within 105 calendar days. So that works out to about mid-May in years we start in February. What that means in terms of calendar days and legislative days, calendar days are exactly what they sound like. And then legislative days are days that the legislature in either chamber, and we'll get to that in a minute, is on the floor doing the business of the people of Alabama. So voting on bills, voting on resolutions, they are on the floor and they are in session. So realistically, that actually could possibly mean that the legislative session could be over in just a few short weeks, right? They could just use up their 30 legislative days very quickly. In a typical legislative session, which I'm not really sure what that is anymore. I'm not sure we have those these days, but in a typical legislative session, the legislature meets on Tuesday and on Thursday on the floor for legislative days, and on Wednesdays, they have committee days. There's nothing set in stone about that. It's not a requirement. It's just typical practice. And in more recent years, more often, they have had legislative days on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, which means that there can be quite a bit of business that's dispensed with within the span of 3 days because of the rules that, again, we'll get to in a moment, that require a certain amount of days for certain events to take place in the legislature. So we're talking about early February to mid-May. There are 140 members in the legislature. That's 105 House members and 35 senators. I don't think I have ever, and Patricia knows this better than I do, but I don't think I've ever gone through a full legislative session with 140 members. There's always someone retiring, resigning, getting indicted, passing away. Something happens to, open up a vacancy. For example, most recently, Senator Greg Reed, who was the pro tem from Jasper, announced that he would be resigning his seat at the end of this calendar year to go work for the governor. And so that's yet another special election that's going to take place. We had special elections last year in Huntsville, in Northeast Alabama. We also had one relatively recently in the Tuscaloosa area. So we're always having, and in Birmingham, there's just one in Birmingham, always having special elections. So it's 140 members, give or take a few vacancies. If you are not familiar with your legislator, that is fine. Most people aren't. Most people don't know who that is. But it is pretty easy to look it up. I am pulling up in the chat, and I'm going to drop in a link that they're also going to include in the notes about this evening's event. But this is with the Secretary of State's website. All you have to do is go type in your address and it'll tell you who your legislator is. You have one House member and one senator. Unlike the United States where you have two senators, you'll have one senator for the state of Alabama. And you can look them up there. It's important to know who that person is because that gives you some direction in your advocacy for who you want to look to, talk to, call when you have concerns or questions. I want to go over briefly who is in leadership in the legislature right now, because there are some really interesting patterns that I think you will notice when I go over these folks. So currently, the Speaker of the House, who is the person who runs the House, he is the most powerful person in the House, much like in the United States Congress. He sets the agenda for their legislative business. He is in charge of committee assignments, who is on what committee. He's in charge of where bills get sent to committee, which we'll go over in a moment. But that is a man named Nathaniel Ledbetter from Fort Payne, Alabama, which is in Northeast Alabama. The pro tem is Representative Chris Pringle. He's the second in command, essentially, in the House. He's from Mobile. Some of you might remember him because he was the House chair of the Reappropriations Committee, their Reapportionment Committee. And so he did redistricting for the last several years, and I know a lot of you were very involved in that process. The majority leader is a man named Scott Stadhagen, who's from Hartselle, and then the minority leader, so the leader for the Republicans, and then the leader for the Democrats is Representative Anthony Daniels from Huntsville. In the Senate, there's a relatively similar setup. However, the person who runs the Senate, like the Speaker does in the House, in the Senate is the Lieutenant Governor. He serves as president of the Senate. That's Will Ainsworth, who's from Gunnersville. There's also a pro tem in the Senate. That's the person who, again, is in charge of sort of setting the agenda, keeping business moving, making committee assignments, et cetera. That is a brand new person. So I just told you that the pro tem Senator Greg Reed is stepping down. And although the official vote has not happened yet, The Republican caucus, who has a supermajority, voted and elected that they would be voting for Senator Garland Gudger from Coleman to be the new pro tem. So for all intents and purposes, Senator Gudger is now the pro tem. The majority leader is a man named Steve Livingston, who's from Scottsboro, Alabama. And the minority leader is a man named Bobby Singleton, who's from Greensboro. So in looking at that list, I think some of you probably noticed that essentially 3/4 of legislative leadership is from North Alabama, from Coleman and parts north of that. That's not to mention the Attorney General, who's from Northeast Alabama. Two of the budget chairs, one in the House and one in the Senate, Senator Arthur Orr, who is the chair of the Education Trust Fund, and then Representative Rex Reynolds, who is the chair of the General Fund, are both from North Alabama. They're from Decatur and from Huntsville. There is a ton of power right now concentrated in the northern and particularly northeastern part of the state. You probably noticed that when you go and drive on state highways on your way up north. They look a little bit different in the northern half of the state than they do here. That's because there's a lot of power there, and they're able to direct a lot of money and attention to that part of the state. There's, varying opinions about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it's something to note. So in the next 10 minutes, we're going to talk about how the work gets done in the legislature. And I know later on we're going to watch some videos of some of this that will put a little bit more color to what we're talking about. But for the time being, we're going to talk about how a bill moves through the process. And I'm actually going to use Senate Bill 1 because I think Tara's going to use that as an example later in the Alabama Channel portion of the presentation to talk about this. So Senate Bill 1 was a bill that was filed last legislative session that made it a felony to provide certain forms of assistance for absentee ballot applications. It was pre-filed, which means it was filed before the legislative session starts. That doesn't mean anything except it was filed before the session starts. Sometimes that means it's a priority issue. Sometimes it means the legislator had a bill ready and just wanted to go ahead and get it through the process. For this one, it certainly did signify that it was a priority for the caucus. And the bill sponsor, Senator Garland Gudger, who's now the pro tem, got out there really early talking about this, putting in the media, et cetera. So it was filed first in the Senate. And when it was filed in the Senate, before it showed up on the legislature's website on Allison, which I think Roger's going to talk to you about later, it had to go to the pro tem, and the pro tem decided what committee that bill was going to be referred to. And I do believe it went to Senate Judiciary Committee. For this purpose, let's say it went to Judy. And that was almost entirely at the discretion of the pro tem. If the pro tem had said he wanted it to go to the Senate State Governmental Affairs Committee, that would have made sense as well, right? So oftentimes leadership will use committee assignments as an opportunity to send bills to either a really friendly committee or, for bills they don't like, to a really unfriendly committee. I've had bills go to committees that make no sense whatsoever other than, leadership knew that the chair would never give it a hearing. So then let's say it gets sent to Senate Judiciary. It would then have been up to Senator Will Barfoot, chair of Senate Judy, to decide when that bill might get a hearing. And the chair has a huge amount of latitude in that process. The chair can put a bill on committee for the first committee day of the session, or can never give a bill a committee hearing. It is essentially entirely their decision, minus whatever pressure might be placed on them from legislative leadership. And let me also say, everything that I'm about to tell you is how the process should work. There's a giant asterisk next to that about how the process actually works. So if I'm explaining something and you think, wait, Katie, last year, that's not how that worked, you're probably right. And there's probably some exception and some reason for that. So when a bill gets sent to the committee, it's then up to advocates like us to go on to Allison, see, okay, SB1 was referred to Judy. I want a public hearing. What do I do? You are then responsible for figuring out who the clerk of that committee is, also by navigating the legislature's website, and sending that person an email and saying, hi, my name's Katie Glenn. I'm a concerned citizen, and I'd like for there to be a public hearing on SB1, if and when it comes in front of Senate Judy. The process for that, again, is not one that's really publicized anywhere, but it's relatively informal. And a public hearing is just an opportunity for members of the public to make comment for or against a bill. In the Alabama legislature, there is no written record. So oftentimes when I work with national advocates, they ask if they could help submit testimony for the record, which sure you can. There isn't one, but you can email it to all the legislators on the committee if you want. And unfortunately, the most powerful thing that you're able to do is show up in person, which is not accessible for people who work during the day, for students, people who don't have transportation, etc. I'm so sorry. I have a toddler at home, and so I always have a cough. It is not an accessible place to show up. It is not somewhere with public parking nearby that's easy to get to, right? If you've been to Montgomery, you know that. But the most powerful thing that you can do to influence the legislative process, other than calling, emailing, contacting your legislator, is often showing up in person. And so when you show up for a public hearing, you show up in the room the day of the committee meeting, and there's a little piece of paper at the front of the room that you just put your name on. We are very low tech in the Alabama legislature. There is no Zoom testimony. There is no way for you to participate in a public hearing from afar, unfortunately. But typically how that goes in committee is the committee chair will say, okay, we have 3 people I'm going to let speak for, 3 people I'm going to let speak against. I think Patricia's going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, but you each get 2 minutes and you get up there and you get to oftentimes talk about some of the most meaningful parts of your life, a terrible thing that happened to you, a wonderful thing that happened to you, something you're incredibly passionate about in 120 seconds. After that, most committees don't vote on the day of a public hearing, but let's say we had the public hearing last week on Wednesday. It's the following Wednesday, and the bill is up in front of the committee. And following debate, there's sort of a limited set of things that can happen. One is the chair can say, or any member of the committee, I think we need to work on this a little bit longer. I move that this bill be carried over, meaning we don't vote on it today. This bill be referred to subcommittee. Subcommittee could be in Senate Judiciary. They might have a subcommittee on criminal cases, a subcommittee on civil cases, etc. So he might say, I'd like this bill to be referred to the subcommittee on criminal cases, right? And then it would go to that subcommittee for further debate and further study. Sometimes, especially in committees like Judiciary, that is a real thing that happens. In other places, subcommittees are a place for a chair to send a bill to disappear for a little while. Which sometimes works for us, some against us. But let's say they have a vote on the bill, right? Robert's Rules of Order, there's a first, there's a second. If a bill is voted on, there can either be a voice vote or a roll call vote. So that either means everyone just yells aye or nay, or they go through one at a time and say, okay, Patricia Todd, Katie Glenn, Kim Bailey, and we each say our votes out loud. A bill can either pass on a voice vote or a roll call vote, or it can fail. If a bill fails in committee, it doesn't necessarily mean it's dead forever. It could come back again, but that typically it's pretty over. If a bill passes out of committee, and I'm about to speed up a little bit, so I apologize, it then is sent to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee decides whether or not a bill is going to be placed on the bodies. We're in the Senate right now. So SB1 has gone to the Rules Committee. They decide when and where on a calendar that bill will be placed. In the Senate, well, let me start in the House. In the House, the Rules Committee is a very open and transparent group of people. They take turns, they go in order, and you get to go to those committee meetings and listen and hear what's going to be on the calendar the next legislative day. In the Senate, it is a secret room that Jabba Wagner and Arthur Orr and a few others go to, and they come up with a calendar, and couldn't tell you how that happens. So 2 very different processes. But we're in the Senate. Let's say the bill comes out of Rules Committee, and they tell me it's going to be on the calendar tomorrow, on Thursday. Then when the legislators come to the floor the following day for their legislative business, they'll dispense with some formalities first. They'll do resolutions. They'll have a resolution to say that sweet potatoes from Alabama are better than sweet potatoes from Georgia. They'll have a resolution to say that Katie Glenn was the smartest person to ever live and we're naming a road after her, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We did spend a long time talking about sweet potatoes once. And then they will work on something called local bills, which we do not have time to get into, but because there is no home rule in Alabama, almost every decision your local government makes is dictated by the state legislature. So you want to raise your property taxes to fund your schools, you want to have a minimum wage in Birmingham, you want to give your sheriff a credit card. All of those things require legislative action. And after they've dispensed with resolutions and local bills, they will begin with the bills they're working on that day. There are tactics that the minority party can use to slow things down, to stop debate, to gum up the works. But essentially, that process is pretty predetermined. If a bill is on the calendar and the majority party wants it to move, it will, because there's supermajorities in both chambers, meaning that there are enough Republicans in each chamber to sort of move the process as they will. They can overcome almost any strategic move that the Democrats might use as the minority party. So once a bill is voted out of committee, or I'm sorry, off of the floor, it switches over to the other chamber and it does the same thing all over again. Once a bill passes through committee, through the chamber, through committee, through the chamber. So we start in the Senate, let's say, or in the House. Bills are filed in both places. It then is sent to the governor for her signature. Again, there are several things the governor can do. She can send it back with an executive amendment saying, hey, like, this bill is great and fine, but I need you to change line 2, the fourth word to say blue instead of red, and then I'll sign your bill. And the legislature can either approve that or choose to reject the executive amendment. But in most cases, she just signs it. It's very rare the governor vetoes something. She vetoed the Literacy Act a few years ago, and that was a really, really big deal. And the way that she vetoes something is also constitutionally outlined and has to do with where we are in the end of legislative session, whether or not she can do a pocket veto, et cetera. But that is my time. We are at 6:50. There's one other thing I wanted to mention just very quickly. And again, I think Patricia might talk about it some, but if you've ever listened to the legislative process, when they're on the floor in the chamber, you may hear them talking about something called the BIR, which is the Budget Isolation Resolution. And it is, again, a procedural hurdle. It was a bill that was passed in the 90s where the legislator said, I solemnly swear I'm going to pass the budgets first, because those are the only two things they're constitutionally obligated to do. And if I'm not going to pass the budgets first, I have to pass a procedural vote with a higher threshold, more than a majority, in order to move on to the vote on the actual bill. The BIR only exists before both budgets are passed. Once both budgets are passed, bills can move much more quickly. So that's sometimes also used as a way to block legislation. For example, last year, Representative England had a great bill that the folks at Appleseed worked with him on around older folks who have been in prison for a long time. And it got a majority of votes in the House, but it failed on the BIR because this was earlier on in the session and it didn't get that, I always forget if it's 2/3 or 3/5 majority of votes in order to pass the BIR. So that's something to note as well. All of that probably sounds really confusing. And I will say, I have been doing this. This is my 8th year now doing this. I learn something new all the time. So if you're ever watching the legislative session and you don't know what's going on and it feels confusing, just know that we're all right there with you. Even those of us who do this for our job all day, every day, I learn something new every year. So I'll look forward to your questions later on in the evening.
Thank you so much, Katie. So that is a lot to take in. And so, like Katie said, remember, put your questions in the Q&A. I know you're going to have lots of them. So now we're going to move on to Patricia, who's going to go a little more in depth into what actually happens down in the weeds in the legislative session. I can't imagine a better person to tell us about that. I'm sure she has some stories that she may or may not be able to share. So
Well, I do have lots of stories, but next year I'm going to write my book, so y'all have
good.
to see. The reality is that your relationships in the legislature mean a lot, and we have a supermajority of Republicans. The Democrats have very little power. When I served in the legislature, the most important person in the House, as Katie said, was the Speaker. He gets to assign people to committees and committee chairs. But I want to talk a little bit about how people can become better advocates. And Katie talked about this a little bit more. Most people, I guarantee you, if you're at a dinner party over Christmas and you ask people, who's your state legislator, they couldn't tell you. They might mention Tuberville or Sewell or somebody, but they rarely know they're a state legislator. So I encourage everybody on this call to know who your House rep is and your senator. And one thing I will also say is they're bombarded with information. Every time I'd walk into my office, there was a pile of stuff from advocacy groups about one bill or another. I can tell you that petitions do not work in the legislature, that personal contact is the most important thing, whether it's they're having a town hall meeting, or you send them a personal email, or you show up at the State House, or you can also, when they're in session, call the receptionist in both chambers and say, will you deliver this message to da da da? I'll be honest with you, most of the times that doesn't change their mind. They're already committed how they're going to vote on a bill, which is sad to say. But don't expect a response. Most people don't respond to any of those emails or text or anything, which I find very disturbing. When I was a legislator, I responded to every text, every email, even if they did not live in my district. And sometimes they just called me to cuss me out about something, but that's okay. That's part of being an elected official. So you have to be persistent. Now, when you go to Allison, which Roger's going to talk about, you'll see a link to their email address and their phone number. That phone number is not their cell phone. It is usually their clerk's office, or if they're a large delegation, it may be their delegation office. But you can also contact them on their Facebook accounts. Send them a message. And when you contact a legislator, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be, my name is Patricia Todd. I live in your district. I hope you will vote against, blah, blah, blah. And here's why. That's all you have to say, because they're going to read more than that, honestly. They're just not. It's when one thing that's important to know is we don't get the calendar if I'm walking into the house floor. I only get the calendar the day before. So we don't always know in advance what's going to be voted on. Same in committee hearings. You won't know more than 24 hours in advance what's going to be on a committee schedule. So, what I think is really important is the League of Women Voters has given us a great public service in the Alabama channel. So we can go and watch these committees, which we never were able to do when I was in office. And nobody takes notes. They're not public. So nobody really knew what was going on. But the most important thing, it really is being in the State House while they are in session, I should say, and going to your legislator's office, leaving a note, trying to connect with them in person. The best day is probably Wednesday because they have committee hearings and they're, in and out of their offices all day. And to go and participate in a committee hearing and catch them when they're coming out of the office. So that's really, really important. Now, let's say you have a great idea to introduce a piece of legislation. It's not that easy. The public cannot do that. Only legislators can. Now, I'm a registered lobbyist. Luckily, I have a relationship with two close legislators who allow me to draft bills for my organization. So you'll have to find a legislator that's sympathetic to your cause to draft a piece of legislation. And so the Legislative Reference Services does that drafting, sends it back to the legislators, say, is this what you want to do? The really important thing here is developing a relationship with your state legislators, even if they don't necessarily represent your interests per se, but you still live in their district. And, I think that's really important to remember. And the legislative website really needs to be updated significantly. I'm sure Roger can talk about that. It's sort of archaic. It's hard to find things. Right now, we're preparing for the 25 session. You can go on there and look at what bills have been pre-filed that Katie talked about, so you get sort of a sense of what they're bringing forth in that legislative session. Another thing is that we do not get the budgets. The legislators don't get the budget on the first day of the legislature. Sometimes it's delayed a couple of weeks. So we're tied up in that BIR vote, which has killed a lot of good legislation. in the process. It should be a requirement that the legislators have the budget 30 days before the session starts, but that's not how it goes. And then in committee, they all get sort of torn apart. So, what else can I tell you about this? It's
So, hey, Patricia, how do you, Katie mentioned the clerks list, and I know you've talked before about that's one way to, contact legislators. So how do you know who the clerks are? How do you get that
That's
information?
a really good question. The Senate has on their website a list of clerks assigned to each senator, but that doesn't exist in the House. So it's difficult to, I mean, it's difficult to find out who the committee clerks are. Now, in the Senate, every senator has a dedicated assistant. In the House, that's not the case. The House, one clerk may have 7 or 8 House members to serve, and they're constantly changing. So there's not a good way to find out who is whose clerk. Katie, that's something you and I should talk about. So that is the difference between the two chambers too.
Okay. All right. And then one other question I thought of right off is how do the legislators get assigned to committees? So how,
By the either the lieutenant governor or the speaker of the House. And they also appoint the chairs of the committee. So they have a very powerful influence over who sits on what committee. I was lucky enough to serve on the Education Budget Committee, I think for 8 years. And then there are special committees. There may be an inter committee, like we did one on constitutional reform, and the speaker appointed me to be one of the lone Democrats on that committee. I'm sure he probably regrets this at this point, but there are special committees that the speaker gets to appoint.
okay. So are there specific things we as advocates can do, at certain points in the bill? I mean, other than just contacting your legislator, I know in a little while we're going to talk about testimony and that kind of thing. But are there certain other things you do? Like, let's say it gets all the way to the governor's desk. Can advocates really have a voice at that point?
I wish I could tell you yes, but no. The executive branch probably already knows every bill that's moving through the legislature and already has an opinion whether they're going to sign it into law or not. Now, let's remember that we're in a red state. The legislature's majority Republicans and the executive branch is Republicans, so they work in concert together. Now, we have been in situations when I came in, the Democrats were the majority in the legislature, but we had a Republican governor. That's a little different dynamic. But now, there's not much the public can do to influence the governor's vote on a piece of legislation.
Yeah. And one other thing I thought was interesting, you said you don't know what the calendar is really ahead of time. So how do legislators prepare? Do they actually read legislation? Do they know what's
No,
going to?
they don't. The one legislator reads every bill on the calendar, and that's Laura Hall from Huntsville. She reads every bill. Most of us did not have time to read. There could be 30, 40 bills on the calendar, and you may read it, but you don't understand the intent or what's really going to happen. So no, they don't read them. We only get the calendar like 24 hours in advance. I was working full time when I was in the legislature. I didn't have time to read every bill and research it and stuff. Now, unfortunately, our legislature is mostly made up of retired people or business owners or wealthy people. It doesn't represent the demographics of Alabama. I can tell you that.
Yeah. So as advocates, do we have a role then to try and educate in addition to advocate,
Absolutely. What you're doing tonight, I don't care if you're bringing 5 people in to be advocates. That's more than we had this morning. People need to learn how the process works and do not be intimidated by your legislator. They work for you. And I've talked to a lot of people who just don't feel comfortable contacting the legislator. I said, well, then your voice is silent, you know, and if you know they're not going to agree with you, then make a case. I mean, they're your representative. They work for you.
Yeah, I think that's important for all of us to remember. So thank you. Okay, so we'll come back in just a little bit and we're going to talk about preparing testimony and kind of what exactly you do when you're at a hearing. But how do we figure out when those things happen and what's happening? So Roger's going to start us off by talking about Allison.
Okay.
And so Roger, for some people, what is Allison? What does that mean?
Allison's
Say that.
as the Alabama legislature, that's kind of a nickname for it. So when you hear people say Allison, that's what they're referring to, the Alabama legislature website. So,
Okay. So do you have, are you going to show it to us? Are you going to give us a demonstration?
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen.
Okay, great.
So this is our the last time we all got together for an education, we talked about the post-election training. Today we're talking about exploring the Alabama legislation website. So please, what you can wait till your questions are over after presentation. And this is what we're going to be going through. In that beginning, the Alabama legislation website, we'll be going to the website, and I broke the website page into two sections: the top page and the bottom page. We're going to look at how to look up bills, what's on the current session, finding meetings, the Alabama channel, early voting bill announcements, and summaries. So the Alabama legislation website is a great website because it's full of information about the Alabama legislature. Here's what you can find. You can find the pre-filled bills. All the bills have been submitted through the years. Bills scheduled for a particular day to be debated. One, you can download a bill to see what it contains. You can follow the history of a bill, who is on the certain committees, and you can find out who your representative is on this site. And you can watch a bill go through a committee. So this is what Allison looks like on the first page. It is kind of intimidating because it has all these little tabs on it, and then they have the big icons. And this is what the second page would look like. So we'll be working with the tabs on the top of the page. So let's go to the tab that's named Bills. So this is the website. As you can see, we have tabs up here. Most of them are drop down. And then they put these.
Hey, Roger, we can't see it.
You can't?
No, we're still seeing your PowerPoint.
I think if you share your whole desktop, you'll be able to go to the switch between.
Hang on. See it now? Yeah.
Yeah.
You see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see the tabs are up here, and most of them have a drop-down menu. And what they've done here is put these big icons, which is the same thing you see on the tabs. So if you want to look up a bill, if you talk to your neighbors or your friends, say, there's a bill out there, I'm kind of interested and see where it's going. You can go to bills, you see there's a drop-down menu there. And it has a current session, all sessions, bills by your House Speaker, and bills by your Senate sponsor. So when you click on that, so we'll click on what the current session is. And as you can see, this is 2025. So this is what's on what they call the pre-filed bill information. So when you look, you see all this information up here. You notice you can click on all of these. And you can scroll down to all bills going on. And we're up to 98 bills for the first pre-filed session here. So if you're interested in the bill, this kind of works like a search engine. So let's say we look at early voting bill. Just type it in there. Nothing's in search. So we'll go to the all sessions. So here we have HB 59. And this is the information about that bill. Pending committee action in origin, elections voting require each county to provide at least one early voting center prior to the election. And if you want, you can also see as Thomas Jackson sponsored it, bodies in the House, subjects, elections and voting campaigns. And the committee is going to be the Constitution campaigns and elections. That's going to be the committee has to go through. And this is the bill itself. As you can see, again, it's Representative Jackson. So when you scroll down, you can see what the synopsis of the bill is. And it talks about the existing law: a voter in Alabama may vote only on election day unless he or she is excused, has an excused vote absentee ballot. So this is the bill itself, and you can scroll down and read it. And you can also come up here to print it off or download it. So when you look at it, and also when you go here, like it says on that bill, you have your committees over here: Joint Resources, Bills, Legislation Day. So let's look at this one. This tells you that. It gives you bill history. You can track the history once it starts going through committee. It tells you what's been happening to it already. You have the BIR. She's been talking about the bill isolation resolution, some fiscal notes. But if you're interested in the committee, you can go down over here where it says meetings. And here are the meetings that are listed for so far this month. And like Tara said earlier, they are recording some of these meetings. So if you're interested in the bill and go to the meeting, you can go to room, say, 200, and there you can watch the actual bill being talked about or debated or whatever for that.
Hey, Roger, do you know how many years of information there are? How many years back it goes?
I looked at that today, and it goes all the way back to 1998. I looked up the lottery. That's how far back it goes.
And is it updated, like, how often is it updated? So if there's a new version of a bill or meetings are added, do they do that every day, all day, every day?
It seems like it was every day, because I looked at this yesterday, and they haven't. It's up to 96 bills now, where a couple of days ago it was only 86.
Okay.
So,
and can you show how you find, or like where the list of representatives and committee members are?
right.
How you get to that?
There. If you get lost on this page, you can always go to the home page. So here's your house. Here's your House leaders, your members, House standing committees, your House of Representatives, your state Senate. You got your House leaders.
Yeah, and I believe if you go, like, say you go to House of Representatives and you were to type in, Tuscaloosa, then everybody who had a piece of Tuscaloosa County comes up, I think. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, let me make sure here.
So there are ways to search to try and find out like your whole delegation and those
Right.
kinds of things.
See, I'll type in, you had mentioned Laura Hall. Anyway, so these are your leaders of that.
Mhm.
So, like, you can go to bill search. Like I said, it's a drop-down menu. If you can look it up by your House speakers. It's all it. If you really want to kind of get used to this, it takes a little time just to play with it. That's what I've been doing.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
that. There is a lot of information in there. And you're right. Sometimes it's a little clunky, but once you get used to it, you can
Yeah.
find out a lot of good stuff. So,
Okay. Thank
okay.
you.
So, Tara, we are ready to hear about the Alabama Channel. Which is
Fantastic.
very exciting because, disclaimer, as you mentioned, it is a League of Women Voters project. So can you just start and tell us kind of how it got started and then give us a little more in-depth information about it?
Sure. Just for everybody that's not familiar with the Alabama Channel, basically what it is we provide a free, easy to use, searchable library of all of Alabama's live and recorded footage of Alabama's legislative meetings. So we make it searchable by transcript, and we record all of the live streams that are happening in the legislature, so that people can have those. Because currently, actually back in 2021 or so, when the pandemic hit, the legislature started live streaming their meetings, and that was great, but they didn't retain the recordings. And so in 2022, we started up the Alabama Channel to retain those recordings so that people that couldn't watch 8 hours of a Senate session could go back and search through the footage and see all of that. To date, we've actually recorded 781 meetings. So we have a pretty large library of meetings to search through. And it's a great tool to be able to go back and see some of these conversations that have happened. As Katie mentioned, there's no meeting minutes. City council meetings, you might have meeting minutes to go back to and refer to. During committee meetings in the legislature, there's no minutes. It's just whether a bill receives a favorable report or not. So actually getting to hear these conversations and getting to hear from the public during the public hearings is really beneficial for advocacy groups, for legislators themselves who may not be able to find out what's happening in these committee meetings. They can now actually go and listen to some of the bills they're about to be voting on when they get to through committee to the House or through the Senate committees to the Senate floor. What I wanted to do is give you all a demonstration and show you some tips and tricks on how to use the Alabama Channel effectively so that you're all prepared for this upcoming legislative session and you can be the best advocates possible. So I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. I'm going to start out with the Alabama Channel. So this is what the Alabama Channel looks like when you go to the homepage.
And what's the URL for that?
It is the alabamachannel.org. You can go there and it'll get you right to this page. You can go to, we have a lot of information on here that you can explore through. We talked about how to find your legislator. So we have links to finding your legislator, how to contact your legislator, how to follow a bill. So you can explore all of that. But the primary feature we have here, of course, is all of our archives. So let me show you that. We go to watch meetings. And under Watch Meetings, you'll notice we have different categories. It's a House, Senate, House committees, Senate committees, joint committees, which the joint committees are during the legislative session. Sometimes there'll be joint committee sessions, and then off session. So the off session is basically all the meetings that happen outside of the legislative days, basically. So over the summer, our legislature is still in action. Like the legislators are still meeting through contract review committee meetings, joint prison oversight committee meetings, sunset committee. Just today, there was an opioid settlement committee meeting about how the opioid settlement money is going to be handled in Alabama. So there's always a lot of really interesting information being pumped out and meetings that are happening that you can still engage with outside of the legislative session. One thing, the search functionality of the Alabama channel is really one of the most powerful things that we have. Alabama, for those that don't know, is only one of 4 states who are not currently archiving and recording their legislative meeting footage. And so even the states that are recording their footage are sometimes not making their footage searchable. So because we have this tool, it makes it easy for people to get to the information they need pretty quickly. So one way to do that, whatever topic you're interested in, hearing aids, if voting, whatever it is, you can come in here and type it into this box. So if I put absentee voting, for instance, since we talked about SB1, I'm going to type that in and search. And what this does is it goes out and it finds every single time, and out of the 781 videos that we've captured, it's going to show you every time absentee or voting was mentioned in any of those meetings. So we scroll down, you can see some of the agenda items here. So you'll see HB 423 had something at ranked choice voting, absentee is mentioned in there. We scroll down, you can see there's the SB1. When you click on that link, that hyperlink, it's going to go right to the moment where that caption is mentioned. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for you all.
Okay, quorum being present, we're ready to conduct business. First bill on the agenda will be Senate Bill 1, Senator Gudger.
So this is Senate Bill 1, and he mentions absentee voting, so I won't play the whole thing, but you get the point.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to be here today in committee. Appreciate all the hard work and time.
So that's SB1. As you can see here to the right of the video, you'll see the agenda items. Basically, these are all the bills that were discussed during this meeting. If you go down, you will also see the agenda listed down here. That has all the bills that were discussed. If you click here, there's this little checkbox. You click it and you go to Journal. And what that's going to do is show you every member of the committee that's in this room. So every year, the committee members might change slightly, especially after election year, they're going to change dramatically. So we make sure to capture all of the people that were in the room where it happened, right? So you can see who was there and who discussed what, just in case, some of these videos are kind of hard to see faces. And so you can kind of make out who said what and then go down and see those pictures below there and their information as well. If you get to this point and you say, gosh, that was a really interesting comment that was made. This discussion needs to be shared with my friends. I need to tell everyone about what happened in this committee meeting. You can go to share and it will start the share right at the start time of 1849. If you get to a point in the meeting, you're saying, oh, I really need to get to that whole conversation that happened. Like I was able to get there through the captions, but I need the whole thing. You can come up here and you can go back just a little bit and make sure you capture that entire conversation about SB1 or whatever the topic is. And if you hit play, you'll see that it's going to start at the time that you're interested in like having that start. And if you go to the little red dot, that'll say 1825. So what you'll do is come down to the start time and just change that to 1825. Now, when you share this link to Facebook, Twitter, or you just copy and paste it into an email, that will start at that time. So that's kind of an important feature. You can also download it at archive.org. So, all these different ways that you can capture this information. One of the things to keep in mind when you're searching on the Alabama channel is it's in the transcript. So if you're searching for, say, a specific bill number, you're going to want to type it in a few different ways, right? So if it's House Bill, whatever, a House Bill 200, for instance, you're going to type in House Bill 200 and you're going to type in HB 200, because during a committee meeting, they might say HB 200, but when it's on the House floor, they might say House Bill 200. So just think about the way things are spoken in meetings and then try some different ways to do that. One thing that you can use is Allison in order to find the meetings that are from the past. So if you go over to Allison and then you go to the bills and you go to all sessions. So say you wanted to find out what happened on absentee voting. You'll type that in and you'll go down and you'll find 2024 is SB1. So you would click on that. And if you go to bill history, you'll see all of the different committees it was assigned to, when the date those committee meetings happened, which is really important. So if you see down here, it was actually assigned to the Senate Committee on State Governmental Affairs, and that was on February 6th, but on February 7th, it was reported out of committee. So if you go to the Alabama channel and you know that we're looking for Senate committees, so we go back to watch meetings, and then we go to the category Senate committees. You're going to go to that Senate committee meeting. So we're going to go all the way back to page 10 and go back to February 7th. And you're going to see this is the Senate State Governmental Affairs Committee meeting is right here. So we were able to use the history of the bill in Allison to go ahead and find that meeting. And now I can get right to that discussion on SB1 that I was looking for.
Quorum being present, we're ready.
That can be really helpful when you're trying to find these different meetings and different bill numbers. Because if you think about it, SB1 there's going to be an SB1 every single year. So if you type in SB1 into the Alabama channel, you're going to get everything that has an SB and a 1. And that's not only every single year, but that's every bill that has a SB1 and anything that's following that. So different ways to utilize the Alabama channel. We re-live stream all of Alabama's legislative meetings to YouTube, Facebook, and our website all at the same time. So as this is happening real time, we're also sharing real time. So that's important. You can watch it on YouTube, you can share it. Sometimes people find that to be an easier platform to view versus having, watching it through Allison. And then once it's over, you have the recording that you can share out with your friends and family. Do you have a question specifically that you'd like to ask, Kim?
Well, so how do these recordings happen? Are they all live streamed, or are there other ways that you get the recordings?
Sure. So most of the meetings, Alabama's legislative meetings, are live streamed. However, there are a couple committee rooms that are not set up for live streaming currently. And so what we do is we send volunteers. This past year, we had some interns that helped us out from Alabama University. They would go in with cameras and record the meetings in person, and then we would get those meetings uploaded. So we try to get every single legislative meeting that's happening, especially during the legislative session, recorded, even if we have to do it in person. This is something we are going to be doing again this year, is having people in those rooms to record those meetings so we can get it all added to our library. Fortunately, or hopefully in 2027, maybe when the new state house is done, all of the meeting rooms we've been told will be set up with live streaming. And hopefully by that time, the legislature will catch up and actually begin recording these meetings as well. But time will tell if that will happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to, as far as who records the meetings, I primarily record most of the meetings, but we do have volunteers. Roger, for instance, helps us record some of the meetings. And if anyone out there, I'll put a link in the chat. If anybody would like to volunteer to help us record some of these meetings, we are happy to have you join the volunteer team, and I'm happy to train you on how we work our recordings.
Great. So do you have any specific plans to expand the channel, or features you're going to add, or anything like that?
So really, our primary goal is to get as many meetings as possible recorded. if you pay attention, there's a lot of task force meetings and joint other meetings that are happening throughout the summer that feed into the legislative session. They feed into the decisions being made. Sometimes they're not even happening in Montgomery. Sometimes they're happening throughout the state. And so, maybe adding more of those meetings strategically into the fold would be something that we're looking to expand to do. But primarily just making sure the information we have is as great and user friendly and free and all of these things as possible. A lot of our footage is getting utilized by the media, for instance, who may not have reporters to go into every committee room, but they're putting together pieces. They need to have direct quotes. They can use our footage. Advocacy organizations, of course, utilize our tool, as well as legislators and the public as well. So if anybody ever has any questions about it, I'm happy to jump on a call with anyone or, talk to you about this in more depth. But it's just the Alabama channel at lwval.org, and I will put that into our chat.
Great, thank you. And I love the fact that you can share video clips. I think that might be perhaps one way, if you share it on your social media and tag your legislators, maybe they might, pay attention to that if you want to point out how you would like them to vote on certain things.
And just one more thing to add to that. If you are going down and you're speaking during a public hearing, you have to state your name. And so your name gets added to the transcript of that meeting, which means you can type your name in. For instance, if I type in Kathy Jones, it will pull up when Kathy has spoken in front of the legislature. So you come down here and you'll see that Kathy Jones is mentioned here. So if I click this, it is going
Okay, I'll put it into the permanent record. Chair now recognizes Kathy Jones from Huntsville.
So Kathy is going to give her testimony for this permanent joint legislative committee on reapportionment, right? That's a pretty powerful thing to be able to say, okay, I'm getting up in front of this committee. I'm going to show all my friends that I got up in front of this committee and feel this way about this bill, right? So you could share it with your legislators. You could share it with your friends and family. Share that moment right there. It's a really quick way to engage others in the advocacy that you're doing yourself.
Wow, that's great. That search is very, very strong. So that's good. Great. Well, thank you so much, Tara. So now we know kind of the process. Now we know, how you find your information online. And so what do you do now? You want to go down and you want to testify at a hearing, at a committee meeting, when that's going to happen. So Patricia, what are some tips that we can provide the participants this evening with? What do I do now?
Well, if you want to testify in a committee, you need to be there early, and you need to sign up, like they said, at a podium in the front of the meeting. They usually only take 3 speakers, and you have 2 minutes. So you need to prep your speech to 2 minutes and be very specific and make your points clear. Because if there's more than, I've been in committee hearings where there's been 30 people sign up to speak. They're only going to take 3 pro, 3 con, and it alternates. So be prepared. And usually there's an advocacy group that's working for against the bill, and you should connect with them to figure out who should be on the list to speak.
So do they just take the first 3 that sign up, or can they just pick and choose, or how do they do that?
They usually just take the first 3 that signed up, pro and con.
Okay. So can you give them a handout? Can you, provide them with information other than your 2-minute speech?
You can, but they're not going to read it. I'm going to be honest with you, they're not going to read it. They're just not. So it's not very effective to do that.
And will they ask you questions? Should you be prepared to answer questions, or they just listen to you? And
no, they might ask you questions. You should be prepared for that. But most of the time, they just listen to your testimony and move on to the next speaker.
And so at a, so if you go to a committee, well, I guess this is my question. So we've talked about asking for a hearing on a bill and a committee meeting. Are those the same things or are they different?
No, it's the same thing. The best thing to do is reach out to the clerk of that committee and say, when this bill's on the committee calendar, I want to call for a public hearing. That's the best thing to do. Now, senators, we know we know in the House who are the committee clerks for every committee. And same with the Senate. And that's who you need to contact to call for a public hearing. And they will do that.
Okay. And how many bills do they usually address at each committee meeting? Does it vary?
It varies. It varies. I mean, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 10, but it just varies.
Okay. Okay. Does anybody else have any other tips or anything that people should know as they prepare to want to do this?
Yeah, can I offer something real quick, Kim?
Yes.
There was a question in the chat that Christy asked about how many bills that legislators bring are model bills or things that have been brought to them by advocacy groups. And that made me think of a point about public hearings. So I'll come back to that question. My point about public hearings is you are the expert. These legislators either don't have time, as Patricia rightfully outlined, there is too much. In the state of Florida, there's professional staff that provide analysis and numbers and background information. Particularly for House members, there's nowhere near that level of information. So you are the expert. If you're coming in there and saying, this is my lived experience, it is incredibly likely they know way, way, way less than you do about the topic, if only because they didn't have time. But it is also incredibly likely that the bill sponsor doesn't know anything about their own bill, because so many of these bills are handed to legislators. Now, I will tell you, I work with legislators regularly to draft bills. I would certainly hope that my bill sponsors are better prepared and know what's in their bills. But when you hear about a bill that got filed in Alabama or got filed in Georgia and then Mississippi, and then we start our session and it gets filed in Alabama and then it gets filed in Louisiana, that's because it's one of those model bills put together by ALEC or people at the Heritage Foundation, the Eagle Forum, etc. There are very well organized networks, particularly on the right, that shop around model bills. Now, I think that practice originated with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the best known for this practice, but now exists across the country and across the political spectrum, right? When I was working at Planned Parenthood previously, we had a whole group of folks who would help us with model language, right? We had people on staff to help with that. So to answer that question, yes, it is a thing that happens. Legislators will also say, I really liked this thing I heard about at a conference that happened in Oklahoma. LSA, people who draft the bills, can you look at this Oklahoma bill and write it for Alabama? So it's important to know that you are the expert, not only because you're coming in with your real lived experience, your real life expertise, and also because oftentimes legislators, by merit of how the process works or by merit of who they are, one of the two, don't have that information. And, are working on 1,000 other bills at the same time.
Okay. So I guess that might lead to sloppy legislation.
So you said it, Kim, not me. Oftentimes, we talk about the unintended consequences of legislation in Alabama, and I have a great example for you, which is in 2017, when Patricia was in the legislature, a bill was passed to authorize a ballot initiative saying that Alabama was a right to life state. And the purpose of this bill was to put it on the ballot in 2018 to drive Republican turnout when Walt Maddox was at the top of the Democratic ticket, right? That was the political purpose of this. Ballot measures are oftentimes mechanisms to drive turnout for elections where the majority party might be concerned that otherwise people might not turn out, right? This is something that happens on both sides of the political spectrum. That's why we saw a lot of progressive ballot initiatives this election cycle, right? So anyway, this was on the ballot in 2018. It passed 65-35. And then this last year, the Alabama Supreme Court heard a case about IVF and said that our state constitution does not allow for IVF services in Alabama. And legislators said, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what we meant to do. We didn't care about IVF. We were worried about abortion. What are you talking about? That's not what we meant to do. When I can tell you, because I worked on that ballot initiative, at the time we told them this language is so overly broad, it's going to have impacts on contraceptive services, on fertility treatments, et cetera. And legislators were unconcerned about that, and they voted for it anyway. And then the people of Alabama voted for it anyway, right? And then we saw a pretty big unintended consequence that had Alabama on the front of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC for weeks on end, as the legislature debated how to go back and fix their mistake. And they put a Band-Aid on it. I think they're probably going to have to deal with it again this session.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. Now, I think we will open it up to questions now. So I'm not sure, Judy or Pam, are you going to read
I'll be
questions?
glad to. Austin Connor has a question for Patricia. Todd, what are the best methods and strategies in building a relationship with your legislator?
Well, first you need to know who they are. Second of all, try just an introduction, email, text, call their clerk, say you'd like to talk to them about something. And if they do public events, which most legislators do, show up and then introduce yourself. The best way you can influence a legislator if you get to know them one-on-one and talk to them personally. But you've got to be persistent because it's not easy to do that. And or look on their social media pages and message them.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Fred Wheeler. Is it possible to change the geographical makeup of the power structure? I'm assuming he's talking about the North Alabama power structure right now.
Well, that's a partisan issue. We know the Republican Party in Alabama is very strong. The Democrats are very weak. It's hard to get people to run for office, especially statewide. Now, when I got elected in 2006, the Democrats were in office. But that changed after the 2008 election when the Republicans took hold. So you just got to continue to vote, be engaged in your state party, whichever party it is that you support, and, make sure you show up for those events. That's how we make a difference.
Thank you. We have another comment. Is public comment different? And will they let more than 3 pros and 3 cons in a public comment? Are they the same?
They will not let more than 3. And even though you may have public comments that you've written, you may give them to the clerk, but it's not going anywhere. It's the first 3 people on that sign-up list in committee. Unlike congressional hearings where the public can make public comment, that's not true in the state legislature.
So how do you get through to legislators on committee in your testimony? I guess that is, besides your testimony, how would you reach them on the committee?
Well, I think you need to be very well prepared and make your points very precise, and then follow up with the committee members with an email. Not that they're going to read them. I hate to be so pessimistic about this, but, I've seen it in action. Is probably the best way. Most people, when a bill comes up in committee, have already made up their mind how they're going to vote on it. It's usually on party lines, unfortunately. So it is difficult, but you just got to be persistent at what you're doing.
Thank you. Judy, do you have any questions from the group here?
I think we answered majority of them. Let me look real quick.
Okay.
I do have one question while Judy's looking. So I'm not sure who wants to answer this. You can all jump in if you want to, but when bills come up, do they typically pass in the first round, or how many times might a bill come before the legislature before it is passed?
Well, if it fails on the first try, it's pretty much dead. Wouldn't you agree, Katie?
Yeah, I was going to say that is such a good question, Kim, because I worked on a little bitty bill that I actually think, Patricia, you worked on this before I did, to change like a tiny part of Alabama's sex ed law. We were not even doing anything interesting. We were not making sex ed compulsory or expansive or anything. We were just making it medically accurate and taking out the homophobic language in the code. I think it took us 8 years. Whereas the IVF bill I just mentioned passed in 5 days. So it all depends on what 5 legislative days, basically the minimum amount of time that a bill can pass in. It all depends on what the majority is interested in. Similarly, SB1, which was like my organization's big fight last session, it had come up in various forms 3 years before that. And we had sort of fought it off at varying points during the session. It just depends on what public sentiment pushes, what powerful people in the public. It's important to note that the reason the IVF bill moved as quickly as it did is because there were a lot of very wealthy and white women coming to that building to push those legislators in that direction. But also what the majority decides they're interested in. Maybe this year they'll decide they're interested in, expanding Medicaid. I'm just going to speak it into existence and then it'll happen. The only thing that seems to not be predictable based on what the majority or based on what leadership is interested in is gambling. If anybody tells you they know what's going to happen with gambling in a year, they're lying to you. But other than that, things can really turn on a dime.
Following up with Katie on that, because bills happen year after year and they transform slightly, that's one really good reason to go back in the Alabama Channel footage and see what was said in the committee meetings and things about the bills that we know are going to come back again, because you can see some of the arguments that are made that are for and against, and it can help you better critique and formulate what you're going to do the next year when that bill is seen again. And I want to share my screen just one more time, if I may. There is a feature on the Alabama Channel website that we are working to expand, and it's our blog. Sometimes these bills and topics, there's just so many bills about different things, and we are trying to break that down to help people see the entire list of different, maybe gun legislation, divisive concepts, and these different topics. Voting is something we're working on right now. If you click on one of these blogs, you're going to see all the bills dating back from 2022 through 2025, like all the pre-filed bills. Bills that have been discussed in the 2024 legislative session are going to have videos. So if you click on one of these bills, it's going to come down. It has a link to the bill language, the introduction of the bill, and then anywhere it was discussed in the legislature. So you can go in, you can click on it, you can hear what was said about it. So we're just trying to make this information as accessible to you all as possible so that you can be as effective as you can be.
And let me just comment here that when things don't make sense to you about why they passed, follow the money. In Alabama, we have more registered lobbyists than there are legislators. There's probably 4 to 1. They have a huge amount of influence in the legislature. And that is negative, in my opinion, that they listen more to people who are getting paid, and they get paid a lot of money. Let me tell you, there's no poor lobbyists in Alabama. And so you can always go and look at your own legislator to their campaign finance reports and see who gives them money. And that will tell you a lot about what their agenda is.
So if we could just jump back to some nuts and bolts things a little bit. So I know when we were looking at Allison, there's the tab that talks about like the history of the bill. And sometimes bills are, I don't know, amended, changed as they go through the process. And I'm not sure if it's Katie or Patricia who wants to talk about that, but how does that happen and why does it happen? What makes a change come to a bill and what does that mean?
Well, you can also follow that on Allison. When you go to the bill, you will see the bill history, and that'll tell you when it was amended and what the vote was on that amendment. But it doesn't happen as often as you would think it would when I was there, because the chair of the committee already knows whether, I mean, it wouldn't be on the calendar if the chair of the committee didn't want it to pass. That's the honest God truth. So if it's amended and he doesn't like the amendment, he will somehow kill it. And I say he, because many of the chairs are he's.
Yeah, and I would add to what Patricia said. Much of the work of creating the legislation happens before and in committee. Once a bill gets to the floor, it's pretty baked in, and it's pretty unusual that a bill passes the floor substantially different than how it came in. It could be that, I was working on a bill last year around custodial notification. So when someone is in prison or jail, or in prison, started as prisoner jail. In prison is how it got amended, and is seriously injured or is seriously ill or dies, they have to let the next of kin know. And, we worked on it in committee. There was a member who wasn't super pleased with it. So then it came to the floor. And before it came to the floor, that member spoke to the bill sponsor and said, I'd really like to cut the county jails out of this. And so he came to the floor and said, this is an amendment we've discussed. This is an amendment you're happy with. This is a friendly amendment. And it got added on, and everyone sort of expected that to happen. Amendments that the sponsor does not want are pretty unusual, unless it's someone in the minority party. Sometimes something will get forced on there. But typically, the most substantive changes happen in committee and before a bill gets to the floor.
Let me just comment on that, because when I was there, we actually passed the Alabama Accountability Act that gave public money to charter schools and private schools. When that bill was in the House, it was very simple, and we didn't agree with the Senate bill, so it was sent to a Senate committee. It was a 3-page bill in the House that turned out to be a 24-page coming out of that Senate committee, and nobody had time to read it. So these things can happen very quickly, and you really have to have somebody down there who's looking out for what's going on. I was shocked at how they handled that bill. They turned it into something completely different.
Can we have a question from Sue Winters? May we get a list of committee members and then send each one information on our issue? And can that be done prior to the vote?
Oh, absolutely, you can. I'm not saying they're going to read it, but if it's important to do that, because look, if I got 4 or 5 constituents that contacted me about a bill for or against, I paid attention. So don't think it has to be 100 people. It can be a few people, because they don't hear from most constituents. That's important to remember.
Yeah, and I would also add the most important time to talk to a legislator is outside of session, because to the point that was made earlier, there are so many lobbyists who give so much money to election campaigns who are going to be the ones whose phone calls they answer during session. And so unless you develop that relationship outside of session, it's a lot harder to get their attention. Again, you can come to Montgomery, you can show up, and I think most legislators do value seeing people from home. But if you can go to their, like coffee with Senator Katie or whatever in the district, that's a really good use of your time, because you're much more likely to be able to have a one-on-one conversation. And then you can stop by their office and say, hi, I met you at Chappie's on Perry Hill Road last November. Don't you remember me? And you're more likely to be able to spark that recollection and have a connection more quickly and more likely to get their attention.
So do advocacy days work? I know a lot of organizations
Yeah.
have advocacy days down there.
Yeah, I think they're important. I think that, do they work? Yes. Do they have the intended legislative outcome? I don't always know, It's important for people to get there. I think they work in terms of educating the public about how the process works, getting inside the building, shaking off some of that mystery. Last year, when we were fighting SB 129, which was the anti DEI bill, about 150 college students came to the building, did amazing, beautiful organizing work. And that bill passed faster through the Senate than I've ever seen a bill pass, right? But that doesn't mean that their advocacy wasn't effective, because those legislators were afraid of them. They all lined up waiting for the caucus lunch to be done one day. And it was a bunch of like 18 to 22-year-olds just wanting to talk to their members. And those legislators all went through a back door and outside the building and around the back to avoid these children who had come to, not children, young
Shocking.
yeah, who had come to see them. So yes, I think it's effective in that like legislators see that the public is paying attention and the public cares. It doesn't always have the intended advocacy outcome, but I think it's important.
So then maybe one thing to think about is you're not only trying to contact and educate your legislators, but getting the word out to the broader public is probably maybe just as important. And really, educating people, because a lot of people don't pay attention, don't have time. They're busy, they're working, they have kids, they're this, they're that, And so really trying to get the word out to the broader public might be as important, if not more so.
Where we start is our kitchen tables and having conversations with our family and friends about what's going on and try to get them engaged. And then plug into an organization that supports your values. That's extremely important because they're going to guide you along the way.
Okay, well, I think our time is about up, and I know Kathy has a few closing remarks. So I want to thank all of our panelists so much for giving your time this evening to educating all of us and getting us ready for this upcoming session so we can all do the good work. So, Kathy, you're muted.
Muted. Take it off of mute first. I wanted to just say thank you so much to all of the panelists and to the moderator for this. This has been a really good, basically gotten us all up and running so that we're ready to start getting this pre-advocacy in January, because that's when a lot of what we're trying to do is to get out in front of the legislative session. And I would encourage everyone, if you've got a coalition to join, you should join it. If you're looking for a coalition, then reach out and ask us, and we'll connect you with the ones we know about. And also, I wanted to just tell you that this is one of a series of trainings that we do. And I wanted to just highlight, we've got one coming up on the 16th of January, focused on why Alabama needs early voting. And that is a critical thing. That Alabama is one of 3 states that doesn't have a form of early voting. And so we've got Representative Clark, and we've also got a colleague of ours that we work with, the Voting Coalition, Sam Duff. And we're also looking for we're looking for a GOP representative who I've heard several of them who want to support early voting, and I'm going to talk them into joining us. We've also got, I'm going to share the screen to show you 2 other forums that we've got. Let me go back and find them. Okay, I'm going to just share my screen. All right. So all right. So we've got another voter skills training. We took off the month of December and put this forum in its place. But if you look at it, this is something we're doing every month, and we're really hitting on topics that we feel like are timely. We're going to be looking at the municipal elections in 2025. There are a lot of them coming up. Tuscaloosa will be the first one. And then we're going to talk about why we need early voting. We're going to talk about it early and often. And then we're going to also talk about the newly expanded moral turpitudes list and what that means for rights restoration, because last session, right in the last week of the session, there was a dastardly deed when they basically they tripled the length of the moral turpitude list. And now it has the effect of law, and we need to be able to understand it better. So that's one of them. The other one that we're going to have is related to improving maternal outcomes in Alabama. And so Representative Marilyn Lands, Representative Susan DuBose, and Delia Abrams will be panelists on this. And we've got one of our members from Baldwin County, Margaret Pace, is going to be moderator. And so I would encourage you, we're going to send out notices for all of these forums. And, as time goes on, we add more and more. And we encourage you to sign up for them. We send out recordings of this one's being recorded, and we'll send it out after the fact tonight or in the morning probably. But we will, that will give you a link so that you can go back and refer to this later. And I want to thank you all for showing up. And that is the first step in something that's really going to transform Alabama. And I'm excited when I hear all of the different groups that have come to me saying we need training for our members. I'm excited because this means that, this is what it takes. Everybody's got to engage and actually go out and talk to their legislators. Let them know what you care about. And I appreciate your time tonight and want to say thank you again and good night.